After learning a lot in Jewish history and Israel history, I've seen that people make a big deal about a lot of different areas. But if you look back, correct me if I'm wrong, if you look back at the history, the areas, these places are really rightfully ours. If it was any other country that would have conquered these places or taken over these places, nobody would make a big deal. It's just because it's Israel and there's anti-Semitism and everything.
Relentless in their attempts to appropriate just about any issue for propaganda purposes, pro-Israel propagandists have taken note of the currency that indigenous issues now have. Hence, some of them have started painting the dominant Israeli Jewish population as indigenous, with the aim of convincing others that Israel is not actually a state formed largely by migrants with no connection to Palestine, who moved there en masse and ethnically cleansed most of those who were there beforehand, but rather simply the legitimate indigenous people retaking their rightful territory. You might have seen some of this rhetoric before, as it's becoming more and more common. There's dozens of articles making this claim, take your pick. And probably the most illustrative example of the extreme end is this bizarre pro-Israel organization / clothing brand called Decolonized Judean. This organization tries very explicitly to take advantage of sympathy for indigenous people among social progressives by appropriating the terminology of indigenous liberation. They frame most Israelis not as relatively recent arrivals, but actually as ancient people from the kingdom of Judea from thousands of years ago who have simply returned to decolonize Judea. Thanks to this magic, Israel is not a colonial project, but actually the complete opposite. So if a Jewish guy from New York who's never been to the Middle East moves to Israel straight into a Palestinian house gifted to him by the Israeli state after its owners were expelled by one of the world's most powerful militaries, he's not actually stealing someone else's house and invading other people's land. Rather, he's an oppressed indigenous man decolonizing.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
No.
Nice one, Brayden. You're definitely just like a Native American dude. It's appropriating the rhetoric of indigenous empowerment and decolonization to attempt to legitimize Israel's current colonialism, a particularly unsubtle attempt to completely invert the reality of the situation. That's exactly the sort of narrative that we're going to be dissecting in this video. The most immediate problem for this sudden trend among Israel supporters is that, back in the day, colonialism wasn't a dirty word like it tends to be today. Europeans in particular were very enthusiastic about it and openly espoused it as a good thing, rightfully undertaken by the strong for their own benefit. The concept of indigenous people was uncommon, and in the limited circumstances where it was used, it didn't imply anything about a right to the land. Rather, it carried a negative connotation and was used to denote people who were considered to be of a lower class, like in France's colonies in Africa, for example. So when Zionism, a political movement to move as many people considered to be Jewish as possible to Palestine and create an ethnic supremacist state there, started gaining steam in the late 19th century, its mostly European adherents didn't mince words. Greatly inspired by the practices and thought of other Europeans of the day, they were a lot more open about the nature of what they were doing than today's Zionists tend to be. They stated often that what they were doing was colonialism, thus making it clear that they were the colonizers. Certainly not the colonized and certainly not indigenous. Theodor Herzl was the founder of the Zionist colonial movement and its first elected president. He's so significant in the history of Zionism that he's often called the father of Zionism, and he is considered to be by far the most representative individual of the Zionist movement. His birthday is an Israeli national holiday, and Mount Herzl is the name of the country's most important cemetery where its national heroes are buried, including Herzl himself. In his 1896 pamphlet, The Jewish State, he outlined his plan for the colonization of Palestine. It would be carried out in the by then long-established English manner, through the formation of a chartered company incorporated in Britain, which would have under its purview what he called colonial tasks. The movement immediately began putting these plans into practice, and the names of some of the organizations that they founded made their nature very clear. For example, the Jewish Colonial Trust, the Jewish Colonization Association, and the Colonization Commission. When it came time to seek out support for this endeavor, the Zionists, of course, didn't try to build networks of solidarity with Native Americans, or colonized Africans, or other indigenous peoples. Rather, they went straight to the colonial powers themselves and said, hey, we want to do colonialism, just like you've done to those people. Want to help? So Herzl sought out meetings with British colonial officials, like the colonial secretary, Joseph Chamberlain. To him, he described the Zionist idea as an opportunity for the British Empire to become bigger by sponsoring a rich colony, and requested the granting of colonial rights. And Chamberlain responded in the same terms, referring to Herzl's request as one for the right of colonization. He also very tellingly wrote to Cecil Rhodes, the most significant British colonial leader and ideologue in Africa, responsible for the colonization of Rhodesia, Zambia, and much of South Africa, where he killed, displaced, and dominated countless indigenous people. Herzl clearly saw this as something admirable, something which was to be emulated. That's why he asked Rhodes for his blessing for the Zionist colonization of Palestine. You are being invited to help make history. It doesn't involve Africa, but a piece of Asia Minor. Not Englishmen, but Jews. How, then, do I happen to turn to you, since this is an out-of-the-way matter for you? How indeed? Because it is something colonial. Vladimir Jabotinsky, a prominent Zionist paramilitary leader who came a generation after Herzl and who inspired countless others, including multiple future prime ministers of Israel, made this even clearer when he talked about the stark reality of the Zionist project, making reference to lessons learned from previous European colonization endeavors. It is utterly impossible to obtain the voluntary consent of the Palestine Arabs for converting Palestine from an Arab country into a country with a Jewish majority. My readers have a general idea of the history of colonization in other countries. I suggest they consider all the precedents with which they are acquainted and see whether there is one solitary instance of any colonization colonization being carried on with the consent of the native population. There is no such precedent. This is equally true of the Arabs. They feel at least the same instinctive, jealous love of Palestine as the old Aztecs felt for ancient Mexico, and the Sioux for their rolling prairies. Every native population in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. This is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing, and what they will persist in doing as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel. Elsewhere, he also wrote, "The iron law of every colonizing movement, a law which knows of no exceptions, a law which existed in all times and under all circumstances. If you wish to colonize a land in which people are already living, you must provide a garrison on your behalf, or else give up on your colonization. For without an armed force which will render physically impossible any attempts to destroy or prevent this colonization is impossible. Not difficult, not dangerous, but impossible." Zionism is a colonizing adventure, and therefore it stands or falls by the question of armed force. From the beginning, the existence of a prior non-Jewish population in Palestine was seen as a barrier to the desire of a purely Jewish colonial state. The Palestinians were, for the Zionists, a problem that needed a solution, just as, say, Native Americans had been for the USA and Canada. They were not moving to Palestine to live alongside Palestinians in peace. They were doing so with the goal of getting rid of them and taking over. Herzl wrote, "We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries while denying it any employment in our country. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly." Israelis, who formed their state from people who'd moved there over the course of many decades, as part of a process that they openly called colonization, who ethnically cleansed as many of the people who were there beforehand as they could, and who still colonize more and more of Palestine every single day, moving people literally called settlers into Palestinian land and homes. It would be ridiculous if some Native Americans migrated to Europe, and then 2,000 years in the future, people claiming to be descended from that group said they have a divine right to cross the Atlantic and conquer North America on that basis. That's the actual equivalent to the pro-Israel argument here. It's clearly nothing like real indigenous claims to sovereignty, and it's clearly just totally ridiculous. A sort of argument and standard that no one would ever seriously entertain in any other circumstance. These sorts of arguments are dangerous to entertain on their own ground, since doing so might imply that there can never be some sort of ephemeral, never-ending, genetic claim to land, going back thousands of years, that can somehow legitimize people moving from anywhere in the world to carry out an ethnic conquest there. I'm going to entertain them anyway though, just to be thorough, because they're so incredibly weak that even when confronted on their own flawed ground, they just don't hold up. They certainly have never proven that they're each individually descended from ancient Judeans from thousands of years ago, nor is evidence of anything even remotely of the sort asked of migrants to Israel. In order to be allowed to migrate to Israel and move into a stolen Palestinian house, all the Israeli state requires is that you have documents attesting to a Jewish mother or grandparent. They don't accept anything further back than that. Israel does not accept ancestry tests as justification for Jewish migration under the so-called law of return. Even if you had a test that somehow proved you were a direct descendant of King fucking Solomon himself, it wouldn't matter. The only time they accept DNA tests is to prove that someone is a direct relative of a presently existing Jewish citizen of Israel, and only in a few limited instances where other documentary proof has been lost, certainly nothing ancient. If we for some reason do decide to take a look at genetic studies, this justification also falls over flat very quickly anyway. Before doing this, however, I want to emphasize again that this has absolutely nothing to do with whether people are indigenous or not by itself, and nothing to do with actual indigenous claims to sovereignty. No one is indigenous on the basis that they are related to people who lived somewhere 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. Jews of European origin were found to share ancestry with Palestinians, though were closer overall to Northern European populations. Jews of Middle Eastern origin were exactly the inverse, closer to Palestinians and more distant from Europeans, pretty much exactly as you'd expect. The authors concluded that their findings support the historical record, which points towards a common origin shared by most present-day Jews and Palestinians. According to historical records, part, or perhaps the majority, of the Muslim Arabs in this country descended from local inhabitants, mainly Christians and Jews, who had converted after the Islamic conquest in the 7th century AD. These local inhabitants, in turn, were descendants of the core population that had lived in the area for several centuries, some even since prehistorical times. The people claiming that ancient ancestry makes that colonialism okay are victimizing people with that same ancient ancestry. This is clearly just incoherent drivel. No one rational actually believes it. One more point that I want to cover here before finishing up is another argument that's often paired alongside this one, the claim that historical anti-Semitism, and in particular the Holocaust, also somehow legitimizes the Zionist colonization of Palestine. This is another fundamentally nonsensical argument, given that Palestinians had nothing to do with any of that. It makes about as much sense as it would to say that Aboriginal Australians have the right to invade Peru in retaliation for what Britain and Australia have done to them. A Jewish state somewhere in Europe, probably Germany, might have been justified as reparations for the Holocaust, but Zionists were already openly calling for and carrying out the colonization of Palestine and planning the expulsion of its non-Jewish population a whole lot earlier. They even found some of their strongest early allies in European anti-Semites who saw Jewish migration to Palestine as a way to get rid of their own Jewish populations. So use of the Holocaust as a justification for Zionist colonialism is clearly opportunistic, because this colonialism long predated it. There is an interesting earlier analog to the Israeli case, the colonization of Liberia. In the early 19th century, white Americans who wanted to get rid of the growing population of black people freed from slavery there hatched the idea to send them to colonize somewhere in West Africa. After all, the logic went, that was where they were originally from a few generations ago, wasn't it? Much like in the Israeli case, their ancestry was used as a justification for colonization. Thousands of black Americans either signed up or were coerced into the scheme. These Americo-Liberians, as they came to be known, colonized the indigenous population, installed themselves as the country's rulers, and oppressed everyone else for their own benefit. Caliphate, a regime they maintained from 1822 until 1980. There's many of similarities shared between the story of Liberia and the oppression justifies Israel argument. Black Americans were clearly an oppressed group, most evident in the fact that slavery was still very much ongoing in the US when the colonization of Liberia began. Does that mean that it was cool and good for them to move there, colonize the land, and oppress its indigenous population for 158 years? The answer is pretty clearly no, and this is reflected in most remotely reasonable opinions on Liberia's founding today, just like the Zionist colonization of Palestine was and still is. It's also another excellent example of what indigenous actually means. In this case, despite their recent couple of hundred-year-old West African ancestry, and the fact that some of them very well might even have had ancestors from Liberia specifically, the Americo-Liberians were not indigenous. Their victims were.
Every single Israeli prime minister has a fake name. I was just talking about Ben Gurion. Do you know what his original name is? It's Grun. G-R-U-E-N. He changed it to make it sound more Jewish and sound more Middle Eastern. Do you know what Netanyahu's real name is? It's not Netanyahu, it's Milkovsky. That's his real name. Israelis are European Jews. They don't come from Palestine, but they want you to make you believe. They want to make believe and make you believe that they come from this area, that they are indigenous to the land, that they're so Jewish, right? Even though they have no connection. So they changed their names. Here's another one. Moshe Sharat, his name is Chertok originally. You've got Levi Eshkol. Eshkol was Shklonik. Then you have Yigal Alon, his original name, Peikovitz. Golda Meir, Israel's first female prime minister. Her real name is not Golda Meir, it's Mabovich. We have Yitzhak Rabin. His name is not Rabin, it's Rubitsov. Are you seeing the pattern? These are Eastern European names. Not Palestinian, not Jewish, not Middle Eastern. They're Eastern European. Yitzhak Shamir. He was wanted by the British police in Palestine for terrorism. His original name is Yezernitsky. Shimon Peres, Persky. Netanyahu, I already told you, Malikovsky. Ehud Barak is Brog. So B-R-O-G. Brog. Ariel Sharon. His original name is Shainaman. And Yair Lapid, who's, you still see him changing posts, his original name is Lampel. Ironically, if you're looking for the people that lived there 3,000 years ago, guess what? They're still there. They're called Palestinians. Maybe today some of them are Christian, maybe some of them are Muslim, but they are the original people of this land. This is why we call Arabs and Palestinians Semites, because they're Semites. They come from this region. The Israelis are not Semites, and they're butchering actual Semites and then calling the real Semites anti-Semitic. I mean, what is that?
Israel did not steal anybody's land. This is another thing I've heard the last couple of weeks, words like occupiers and colonizers and apartheid, which I don't think people understand the history there. The Jews have been in that area of the world since about 1200 BC, way before the first Muslim or Arab walked the earth, 1,000 years before. I mean, Jerusalem was their capital.